Continuing with our discussion about themes that connect the concepts of biology, we are now moving on to our second theme, structure determines function. Structure and function are closely related in all organisms. Evolution has favored structures that function in an adaptive manner. And when you think about a structure, I want you to start out by thinking about three-dimensional shapes, geometrical conformations, charges, attraction or repulsion from water, things like that. But just on the simplest level, think of a three-dimensional shape. And that three-dimensional shape is specialized for some function. We see this convergence of structure and function at all levels of the biological hierarchy, and you will continue to see many examples of this theme as we move throughout our class. Structure determines the function. To illustrate this, we're going to look at a gull's wing. So we're focusing in on a gull's wing here. And as we look at the various aspects of a gull's wing, we can see that there are several things that make flight possible. Various structures of the gull's wing make flight possible. So starting on the top left, we are looking at the gull itself, and you can see the wing outstretched. That wing has an aerodynamic structure to it that facilitates the function of flight. As we move to the right, figure B is showing you some bones that you would find inside that wing. The bones are very strong, yet very lightweight. Again, facilitating the function of flight. Going to C on the bottom left, you're looking at a type of cell called a neuron. Actually, two of them, two neurons. These are cells that have long extensions called dendrites that facilitate rapid communication, and that's important when controlling the flight muscles. And then finally, over on the bottom right, you're looking at a single mitochondrion. Mitochondrion, that is a singular term, and you can see down below we have mitochondria, that is a plural. So we're looking at a single mitochondrion. This is an organelle that is found in all of these cells that make up the gull's wing. Not just the neurons, but all the cells. And this particular type of organelle is very important for energy production, specifically making ATP. As you look at this mitochondrion, there you can see there's a membrane on the outside, but if you cut a little piece of that membrane away, you can see this inner membrane, and that inner membrane has a huge surface area that facilitates a large amount of ATP production, very necessary for flight, which requires a lot of ATP. Our next theme, theme number 3, is the cell is the basic unit of life. The cell theory is something you should remember. The cell theory states that the cell is the most basic unit of life. The cell is, in fact, the lowest level of that biological hierarchy that can perform all essential activities of life. So for that reason, there are some organisms that are unicellular. One cell makes up the entire organism, and that one cell is able to perform all of those essential activities of life. And then other organisms, such as us, animals, and plants, and some fungi, are multicellular, where many cells make up one single organism. Something else that the cell theory states is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. This brings us back to the concept of cell division. Cell division is the basis for all reproduction and for the growth and repair of multicellular organisms. So we'll look into some detail on what cell division is when we get into chapters 12 and 13. But for now, you should understand that all cells come from pre-existing cells. There is no spontaneous generation. For most of human history, it was thought that spontaneous generation did occur. For example, it was thought that toads, snakes, and mice arose from moist soil magically, and that flies arose from manure, and that maggots spontaneously generated from a decaying corpse. It actually wasn't until 1861 that a French scientist, Louis Pasteur, disproved spontaneous generation, which now sounds kind of ridiculous today, given what we now know. Louis Pasteur not only disproved spontaneous generation, but he also developed the process called pasteurization, as I'm sure you've all heard about. There are two types of cells that are used to build all the life on our planet. Organisms are either built from the prokaryotic cell type, so they consist of one or more prokaryotic cells, or organisms are built from the eukaryotic cell type. I want to just make a note that bacteria and archaea, notice how I pronounced archaea? Archaea. Bacteria and archaea are prokaryotic organisms. They consist of prokaryotic cells. All other organisms are eukaryotes. So we're going to talk a bit more about these two different types of cells in a moment. But for now, I want to just really focus in on how all cells are similar, because regardless of if you're looking at a prokaryotic or a eukaryotic cell, we can say some things about them, some ways that they are very similar. So we can say that all cells are tiny compartments surrounded by a thin covering called a membrane. This membrane is referred to as the cell membrane, that thin covering that all cells have, or sometimes it's referred to as the plasma membrane. These are the same thing. So all cells are tiny compartments surrounded by a cell membrane. And this membrane is very important for regulating the movement of materials into the cell and out of the cell. It is a selectively permeable barrier. So we'll make a little note of that. It regulates the movement of materials into and out of the cell. Something else that we can say about all cells is that all cells contain DNA. This is genetic information. DNA is like a recipe or a blueprint for everything that cell does. Information. A cell has to have that information in order to build all of its structures and function properly. And then finally, we can say that all cells contain ribosomes. Ribosomes are responsible for the synthesis of proteins. These are the workbenches for protein synthesis. So they are responsible for joining smaller molecules called amino acids together in order to build the protein. So all cells have these three basic characteristics, but we can get a little bit more specific when we consider what is a eukaryotic cell. Well, we know it's a tiny compartment with a membrane. It has DNA and ribosomes. Same thing for prokaryotic cell, but there's more to it than just that. So the eukaryotic cell is found in any organism that is a plant, animal, fungus, or protist. So plants, animals, fungi, and protists are all built from eukaryotic cells. Plants and animals are all multicellular. So many eukaryotic cells make an individual organism. Fungi and protists vary. So some fungi are unicellular, some are multicellular. Most protists are unicellular. But there are some that are multicellular as well. Regardless, if you look at a single cell, you're going to see this basic type. So eukaryotic cells are characterized by structures within them, most importantly, the nucleus. The nucleus has its own membrane surrounding that, and that's found on the inside of every eukaryotic cell. The nucleus contains the DNA. Eukaryotic cells also contain more membranes inside. There's a whole system of intracellular membranes referred to as organelles, and we'll talk about those a bit later. They do include things like mitochondria, the Golgi complex, the endoplasmic reticulum, membranous structures inside the cell. Eukaryotic cells are also larger than prokaryotic cells. There's a range of sizes here to consider. In general, we can say that most eukaryotic cells are somewhere in the range of 10 to 100 micrometers in size. I want you to find a metric ruler and locate the millimeter dimension on the metric ruler. That's the smallest division you can see. And you should know that 1 millimeter that you can see with your naked eye is equal to 1,000 micrometers. When we talk about the dimensions of cells, we're always using micrometers, and you need to have a microscope to see that unit of measurement. Prokaryotic cells are not as complex as eukaryotic cells. They do not contain a nucleus. They still have DNA, but it's not surrounded by a membrane. Prokaryotic cells do not contain organelles. So they're simpler in structure in the various types of components found within. They are also typically smaller than eukaryotic cells. And again, there's a big range in sizes, but we could say most prokaryotic cells are approximately 1 to 10 micrometers in size. So one example of a prokaryote is Staphylococcus aureus, commonly known as staph. If you looked at a single cell of staph, you would see it's a sphere. It would look like a circle in the microscope. And this one cell of staph has a dimension, a diameter of 1 micrometer. So very tiny cells. Now considering that 1,000 micrometers equal 1 millimeter, how many of these staph cells could you fit in a chain across that 1 millimeter distance that you can see on a metric ruler? 1,000 of them. Here we have 2 electron micrographs. Those are pictures taken with an electron microscope. In this case, specifically a transmission electron microscope. I can tell it's a transmission electron microscope that took these pictures because we can see internal structures. So transmission electron microscopes, or TEMs, take very thin slices through a specimen and then fix them, shoot electrons through the thin slices in a vacuum. And as those electrons pass through the specimen, they hit photographic film on the other side, and we get images like this. They start out black and white, and then they are colored later on to emphasize structures found within the cell. The eukaryotic cell is shown on the left, and you can see it's much larger than the prokaryotic cell that's shown on the right. So big size difference. Looking inside the eukaryotic cell, we can also see a bunch of intracellular structures. So first of all, that outermost layer is the cell membrane. So that's the boundary of the cell. All cells have that. Inside of that cell membrane is a region that we call the cytoplasm. It's all the space between the cell membrane and the nucleus. So the cytoplasm is that whole region in between the membrane and the nucleus. And as you look at that cytoplasm, notice all these structures that are in it. Lots of things inside the cytoplasm of a eukaryotic cell. These things are organelles. So organelles include things such as mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, or the ER for short, the Golgi complex, or the Golgi apparatus, same thing. And we have in plants chloroplasts, another type of organelle. Animal cells don't have that. And then there's vesicles and vacuoles and other membranous structures that you might find inside a eukaryotic cell cytoplasm. This large structure that we see in the center of this eukaryotic cell, this is the nucleus. And recall from previous discussion that the DNA is found inside the nucleus. So we're going to have several chromosomes containing DNA in that region. This particular cell we're looking at has a gigantic nucleus. They certainly are not always that big. I suspect this particular cell is a lymphocyte, one of our white blood cells, because they do have these characteristic huge nuclei. Looking over at the right at our prokaryotic cell, again we see there is a cell membrane, that thin covering, and inside of that cell membrane we do have a cytoplasm as well. And within that cytoplasm you're going to find the DNA. The DNA is not in a membrane enclosed area. It's not inside a nucleus. Rather, it's found coiled up in the cytoplasm. And the region is called the nucleoid. It's a region where you find the DNA in a prokaryotic cell. Note the size scale shown below. Okay, moving on to another theme. We are on theme number 4 now. All cells have heritable information, and that heritable information is DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. Please practice writing that term out, those two words out. You should be able to spell them accurately. Deoxyribonucleic is the first word, followed by acid. And we're going to typically abbreviate it DNA to save us time and space. So all cells have this heritable information, and the continuity of life is based on the type of information that is found in all of the cells on our planet. Chromosomes are structures that contain most of a cell's DNA. And basically, a chromosome is a huge molecule of DNA containing typically millions of base pairs, nucleotides. And we'll talk about what that means later, but it's a gigantic macromolecule. And then in eukaryotic cells, we see that that large molecule of DNA is wrapped around proteins to package it, and then that would make up your chromosome. So DNA is gigantic. It's a very large molecule. And I want you to know a couple things about DNA right off the bat. You should know that it is a double-stranded molecule. So if I just draw that, let's say here's a strand of DNA, here's another strand, and they're stuck together. So there are bonds that hold these two strands of nucleotides together, and that is a DNA molecule, a double-stranded large molecule. Now, on the DNA, we find units of inheritance that are called genes. So genes are simply stretches of DNA that have information associated with them, much like a sentence that we use has information associated with it, so does a gene. A gene has information. They determine what an organism will be like. So here I drew one molecule of DNA. Perhaps there's a gene right here. So gene A. And then further down, there's another stretch of DNA that's another gene, gene B. And then there's another one down below, gene C, and so forth and so on. Every molecule of DNA is going to have hundreds or thousands of genes along its length. The development of a multicellular organism, such as a human, requires many rounds of cell division. And one important aspect of cell division is maintaining the DNA, maintaining that genetic code, because every cell has to have a copy of it. So as we look at this illustration, we're starting by looking at two types of cells. At the top, we have a sperm cell illustrated. Sperm cells are produced by males of our species. And then down below, we have an egg cell produced by females. And these are specialized cells made in the gonads. When a sperm cell and an egg cell meet and fuse together, we have a fertilization event. And that fertilization event causes them to become one single cell. So here we're looking at a fertilized egg. This is one cell that contains DNA from both parents, DNA from the sperm cell and DNA from the egg cell. They're now both in the nucleus of this new cell. And this new cell, this fertilized egg, is also called a zygote. So this is how we all started. Everybody started as a single cell called a zygote. And then that cell had to undergo many, many rounds of cell division. This type of cell division, as a side note, is called mitosis. Many rounds of that to form an embryo. So this embryo now has copies of that initial cell. All of these cells are identical to the parent cell that we started with. And then many, many more rounds of cell division and differentiation to produce a human being. As we grew from babies to toddlers to adults, we continued to do cell division. And as adults, we consist of trillions of cells. And every single one of our cells has the same exact DNA that we started with in that zygote. So DNA is copied in a very specific way to facilitate proper development of multicellular organisms. I want to spend just a little bit of time looking at the structure of DNA. Look at the left of this figure here. There is a cell again. So this cell could be the zygote we discussed previously, or it could be one of these cells in the embryo, or it could be one of these cells in our baby somewhere. It doesn't really matter. It's just one cell. And we're looking at the nucleus of that cell. We're going to zoom in on the DNA in that nucleus. So here is part of a DNA molecule. Everywhere you see a little circle, you're representing an atom. And you can kind of get an idea about the three-dimensional structure of DNA by looking at that space-filling model. However, I want to simplify it a bit by looking at a roadkill model or a flat model. So if I were to redo that space-filling model in flat form, I would see that there's a strand of DNA here attached to another strand of DNA here. Remember I said DNA is double-stranded. So these are actually stuck together, these two strands. So one strand of DNA on the right, and on the left is another strand of it. Together, we're looking at a DNA molecule, a very small one here. DNA is double-stranded. going back to this picture on the left, one strand would be shown here, and one strand would be there. So here's one strand, here's another strand. Those two strands are stuck together, just like I showed you in my illustration on the right, but they're also coiled in a helix. They're twisted, so it looks a little different. Now, if we were just to focus in on one of these strands that I drew on the right, just one of them, we can kind of see a little bit more detail of what it is made of. So every strand of DNA is made of subunits that are called nucleotides. So here is a nucleotide, here is another nucleotide, here is a nucleotide, joined together. These nucleotide letters, A's, T's, G's, and C's, to keep it simple, these nucleotide letters that we will simplify by calling A, T, G, and C for now, are arranged into words, if you will, specific sequences. And each sequence of these nucleotides has a specific meaning, much like, as I said previously, a sentence, much like the words of our language. So the words in the case of a DNA language might be called genes. So we're looking at a specific sequence of these four letters, these four nucleotides, and together they have information in the form of a gene. And then each gene has information that's used to build some other type of molecule in the cell, such as RNA or protein. The flow of information in a cell goes from DNA to RNA to protein. And we'll learn more about that at the end of the term. Notice as we look at this illustration that our sequence of letters goes A, C, T, A, T, A, C, C, G, T, A. That's just the sequence for this particular gene. But another gene would have a completely different order of those nucleotide bases. And really, it's the base of the nucleotide that's represented by the A, T, G, or C. I want you to remember that all organisms on this planet use the same four types of nucleotides to build their DNA. So all organisms use nucleotides with A, C, T, and G. The same four letters are used for every organism on this planet. However, the difference between organisms is the way in which these letters are organized into sequences. That is the difference. That is how the information changes. It's the order of the letters. So this is an important place to note the kinship of all life on this planet. We are all related, and here is a perfect example of that. Our next theme, theme number 5, if you will, is the transformation of energy and matter. All organisms must have mechanisms in place to obtain and manipulate energy and matter. So when we look at the dynamics of an ecosystem, recall that an ecosystem includes all of the biotic factors, all the organisms in a region, and the abiotic factors in that region as well. So when we consider the dynamics of an ecosystem, we're going to look at two major processes that are involved in the transformation of energy and matter. First of all, energy. Energy is going to typically enter an ecosystem in the form of sunlight, and the energy of the sunlight is captured by organisms that we call producers. Producers are photosynthetic organisms, such as plants, algae, many types of bacteria. So photosynthetic organisms have the ability to capture the energy of the sunlight and then transform that energy into organic molecules. So they use that energy to build things like carbohydrates, sugars. Then producers that have built their molecules, their carbohydrates, their proteins, etc. They are going to be eaten by other groups of organisms called consumers. So here's another flow of energy. The energy is moving from the producer to the consumer that eats it. The consumer, such as us, must eat organisms that have already produced organic molecules. So consumers eat photosynthetic organisms and or other consumers. And so this is how energy is going to move up the food chain, starting with sunlight, moving to photosynthetic organisms, and then to those that eat the photosynthetic organisms and beyond. Energy moves in one direction through an ecosystem in this manner. These aren't perfect processes. The energy transformations that occur are not perfect, and so energy leaves in the form of heat. The other major process is the recycling of nutrients, chemicals, molecules within an ecosystem. Matter. Nutrients are required for energy, as an energy source for many organisms. So many of us, heterotrophs, must obtain energy in the form of nutrients. Nutrients are also important for many enzymes to function properly. Rather than moving in one direction through an ecosystem, as energy does in our previous example, as energy moves through the food chain, nutrients, matter, move in a cyclical fashion through an ecosystem. They are recycled. Materials that are acquired by plants are eventually going to return to the soil when those plants decompose. We're going to look at an illustration on the next slide that talks about these two processes. Here we are looking at a savanna ecosystem, and we can see that there is a tree evident, a producer, a photosynthetic organism, and then we have a giraffe, a consumer, that is eating leaves off the tree. Now up above we have sunlight that is striking this savanna ecosystem, and that sunlight brings energy to the ecosystem. So energy enters the ecosystem in the form of sunlight, and producers such as this tree here are going to capture that energy and transform it into a different type of energy, chemical energy. Chemical energy can be in many forms. Perhaps that chemical energy is a carbohydrate. We'll just say, for example, carbohydrates. Or perhaps it's another type of chemical energy called ATP. Molecules contain chemical energy. And then that chemical energy is acquired by the consumers that eat the plant, such as this giraffe here. So the energy has moved from the sun to the producer to the consumer. And then I said this is not a perfect process, so you're going to see that energy exiting as heat. Now looking at the concept of nutrient cycling, let's just consider that we'll start with the roots of our plant. We'll start at the base. The roots of these trees are absorbing nutrients from the soil. Water and minerals, nutrients, are picked up by these plant roots, and they're brought up into the plant and used for various things. Materials that are taken up by the roots become part of the plant, and as the plant leaves die, fall to the ground, and are decomposed by soil microbes, so the plant leaves re-enter the soil, those nutrients are returned to the soil. Also, as those nutrients are taken up by the plant and consumers eat the plant, some of those chemical nutrients transfer to the consumer, and then when that organism dies and microbes decompose it, again, those nutrients are returned to the soil. So there is a cyclical pattern of nutrients moving through an ecosystem. A third concept that has not been mentioned in much detail yet, but is illustrated here, is the fact that organisms interact with each other and their physical environments. And we're going to revisit this concept in just a moment. But for now, consider the tree. This is an organism that's a producer. It's interacting with other organisms and the environment. For example, the roots are obtaining nutrients from the soil, and the leaves are capturing sunlight and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from the air, and as this organism does photosynthesis, it releases oxygen into the atmosphere. The giraffe, a consumer, is eating the nutrients, the molecules produced by the tree. It's interacting with another organism. Not visible on the photograph, because they're microscopic, are many microorganisms that are interacting with both the tree and the giraffe. And there are many microorganisms in the soil that are decomposing material, recycling things. So many organisms interacting with each other. Work requires a source of energy, and organisms are always busy doing work. Work includes things such as movement, growth, repair, building molecules, anabolic pathways, sensory function, and many other life activities. Regardless of the type of work you're discussing, it always requires a source of energy. So, just briefly, I want to talk about what types of energy are available. We can talk about light energy. So organisms that are photosynthetic can use this type of energy, sunlight or photons. There's energy associated with that. Chemical energy is in reference to molecules, groups of atoms stuck together, or we could say nutrients. These molecules contain chemical energy, and the more atoms that are stuck together, the bigger the molecule, the more energy is associated with it. Kinetic energy is movement, and thermal energy is heat. So there are different types of energy, but organisms can convert one form into another as they work through very important aspects of their metabolism and their daily lives. The energy exchange between an organism and its environment often involves a lot of these energy transformations, taking one form of energy and converting it into another. And we'll look at how that works as we address metabolism and enzyme function in chapters 8, 9, and 10.